We are live.
Okay, so welcome you all to our second iteration of the In the Studio panel. My name is Sarah bin Safwan, and I welcome you to Guggenheim Abu Dhabi's program. In the Studio focuses on providing a platform for contemporary artists living and working in Abu Dhabi. As part of Guggenheim's Abu Dhabi's curatorial vision, the museum seeks to support young artists and the local creative ecosystem as it is vital for its growth and sustainability. I'm joined by my colleague Jessica Serasi, and we're thrilled to introduce the artists themselves, Afra Al Dhaheri, Maisel Bake, and Simrin Mehra Agarwal. In today's discussion, they will shed light on the importance of artistic studio practice and how they envision the future art scene, as well as share some insights from their various artistic journeys within the unique art landscape of Abu Dhabi and the UAE.
If you haven't already, we hope you will immerse yourselves in the studio through this video series and share the experience with your friends and family using the hashtags which you'll see below. The whole series of films is available to stream on abudhabiculture.ae or on Abu Dhabi Culture's IGTV on Instagram. And though we're separated by screens and time zones, we hope you'll feel as though we're in the same room by sharing your questions for our artists in the YouTube comment box, which I think is over here somewhere. We will get to as many as we can during the final 15 minutes of our conversation.
To briefly introduce our artists with us today, we first have Afra Al Dhaheri, whose work is rooted in her experiences growing up in Abu Dhabi and the wider UAE, working across various media, including sculpture, drawing, painting, installation, photography, and printmaking. She explores questions of ritual, memory, and process.
Next, we welcome Maisel Bake, a Palestinian artist with an interdisciplinary visual practice triangulating body, language, and place. Crystallizing as performance, video, sculpture, and installations, her work layers a personal poetics onto the sociopolitics that define relationships to geography, looking for moments of mediated as well as immediate contact between place, body, and language.
Finally, we welcome Simrin Mehra Agarwal, whose practice is anchored in how we understand nature, its various states of bloom and decay. In drawings, carvings, and reliefs, Mehra Agarwal creates complex and elaborate compositions that meticulously deconstruct the details to draw out hidden meaning and connections. And with that, we'd like to begin our discussion. Hello, everyone.
Hi. So to start us off, I think something that connects each of your work is the ways in which you explore history, time, and place through their relationship to the body within your practices. How do you see place and the body intersecting within your work? Afra, maybe you could start us off.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I think it's a very interesting question to think about, because I think in my work, history and time is experienced through the body. So the body becomes the place for that experience. And I've constantly tried to slow down this experience of constantly trying to counterpace this experience. And through that, I was able to kind of look inwards and start to become more aware and even sometimes hyper aware of the body, and resulting in going back to working with hair as a material and as an object, a material that is rooted within the body but then extends beyond the exterior of the body and becomes a witness for all of these changes, whether it's time or history, and it becomes a register for that and a major representation in the work that I make. Yeah.
And you, Mace?
Well, first of all, thank you for the intro and for actually starting off with this question. I think everything I've done in my creative practice has stemmed from an interest in trying to understand my relationship to place. And the sort of trajectory that in hindsight I kind of trace in different explorations and different experiments that I've done, both in my practice as an artist, but even, you know, my studies as an architect and in my work professionally, institutionally, I've sort of, by thinking about space, I kind of moved into thinking about the body. I've started by thinking about how the places we occupy actually directly affect our body, and I kind of wanted to really run with that analogy. I wanted to think about, you know, is the room that you grew up in the mold within which you actually, you know, are poured, are cast. Your body grows within them, or sort of pushes against them, like braces, or, you know, like you're sort of this constantly kind of evolving, constantly amorphous thing within I wouldn't say the boundaries, but within the sort of spatial context that you're in, and everything that sort of it carries with it, everything that makes a space a place. And I think it's from there that actually my interest in language came to sort of focus. I was thinking about the body. I was thinking of the body's, like the evidence of this mold place on the body. And so I was thinking of the negative spaces that perhaps this mold has left on the body, sort of just really running far with this analogy, or this sort of perspective of trying to understand these two things. And the first cavity or negative space that I kind of got really excited about was the mouth. And, you know, it's an incredibly exciting space to interrogate, and definitely took me down a billion different rabbit holes of looking at language. And then, you know, I go back to the body and place a lot, but I have language almost right up there in terms of sort of the three thematics that I'm always interested in, because I think we experience place through, it's easy to see how we experience or build a relationship with place through our body, but I think very ubiquitous in the narratives of refugees and in migrants, and also especially in Palestinian kind of narratives, you see that there is a really strong relationship to places despite or regardless of the body's interaction with them. And so that's kind of where this interest in language also continued to sort of flourish, thinking about language from a place, or language that you sort of, you know, dialects, poetic production, but also actually bureaucratic language and sort of legal documentation, etc. So all of these things kind of feel on par and sometimes contradictory and sometimes in parallel to the body in defining our experience to place. And this is sort of this big kind of mashup of different things that I'm always interested in, this constellation or tessellation or triangulation or whatever you want to call it, which is just these three things kind of meshed together. And try to make sense of them, essentially.
Fantastic. I mean, I think Simrin, in your work as well, you when you're drawing nature, you're representing places, but it's also through a language of the body. Would you like to speak to that a little as well?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me for this panel, and yeah, I'm looking forward to this discussion. Yeah, so my practice is mostly based on drawing. But the process, the body comes into it from the very beginning, from the beginning of the research process to the creating of the artworks. And also it has a relationship of how the viewer looks at the artwork. So it's like the body intersecting at three different levels. So during my research process, I generally, it's based on exploring nature. So exploring nature would be like diving deep underwater. Like I'm a certified diver. So I have to kind of, do a lot of technical training with the body. So the body becomes, a mode of exploring these kind of historic places. There are a lot of these wrecks and reefs which are underwater, which are unexplored. So I'd want to go underwater and, through the different techniques of diving, I enter into these crevices of these wrecks and reefs and explore these places. So these places are very uncanny, and your body has to be, navigate through these very uncanny spaces. So I find that process very interesting in my work, and also the integration of the breath, the mind, and the body. These are the three things which exist in the research process, as well as in the creation of the artwork. So when I bring all the research back with me, whether it's like a form of video or some photography which I did underwater, or just a recollection of these spaces. So when I come back to the studio, it's more or less a process of drawing. And within that process, sometimes I work on very small scale works, which are very deeply meditative. And at other times, I'm working on these very, very gigantic artworks in which the body plays a very important part, because you have to integrate your body and your breath while you draw. It's a process of moving forward and moving backward. You look at your work in certain scales and dimensions. So I want the viewer to have that same kind of experience by looking, like you find different forms when you go close to the work. And when you move far away from the work, it kind of, it changes its appearance, and there are different things that you see within that. And through this process of the body, the exploration of the body, I'm also looking at different spaces, historic spaces, which are on land and which are within the sea. So I want to look at how nature comes into this process, and how over time, these kind of machines, they change form, they become abstracted. You have these machines, they're totally distorted. So I'm also looking at the process of distortion within the process of drawing itself. So it's about looking at time and the processes of time and the processes of nature. Like you have crusting and rusting, and how the forms decompose, how they organically they transform into natural forms. And I'm also looking at how these vessels of war, which signify violence, but when nature takes over, they become like signifiers of hope and life. So it's also the interaction with nature, the body, the artwork, and the audience. So I want the audience to have that similar experience in which they can relate to the work through the different movements of their body. So that becomes very important for me.
I think it's so interesting to hear, all of you exploring more or less, the body and place, but in such different ways and in such different mediums and execution. So that's very exciting. And Simrin, just to go back to you on, this your process of research and the way that you, put nature at the forefront in your work. And essentially, I'd like to ask you about when you look at nature and in the context of histories of war or neglect, as well as highlighting contemporary issues of climate change, how did these interests arise for you?
I think the spaces where I grew up in, the landscapes of these spaces, and even the landscape of UAE has a very important role to play in my practice regarding this. So I'll give you a little bit a little brief about how I grew up. So I was born in India, and my maternal family lives in a space in the eastern part of India, in this deeply forested region. So it is also a protected area where you have these, multiple species of different kind of plants and animals. So from my childhood, I've been kind of looking at these forests and these trees. And it also it was neighboring an old and uncanny Second World War military air base. So it was also a process of walking through these spaces, as a child, the recollections of that. So that was something which when I came to UAE, then I was exploring a lot of spaces underwater and also on land. So it was again bringing back those similar thoughts and thinking about how climate change has kind of really affected the landscape of the UAE in terms of, like when I went diving, I realized how the corals were being bleached. In 2017, there was this major coral bleaching that happened here. And also like, with the artificial island development, a lot of these mangroves were destroyed. So, looking at it, climate change, I think artists need to address this issue a lot more. And yeah, it's basically that.
If you haven't seen Simrin's In the Studio film yet, there's some incredible footage of her diving in there, and you really get a sense of the kinds of landscapes she's talking about within her work. But I wanted to also ask you, Afra, as we see in your film, your first monumentally scaled installation work, Tasriha, has become a pivotal moment within your artistic practice. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about working on such a scale for the first time, and is this something you plan to continue within your practice?
I'll need a lot of help. I think that working with Tasriha was such a like rich experience for me, because my work is very much process-based, and each work that I start creating informs the next one, which I was talking about during the video. But what was really interesting is that in this particular moment, I was actually planning to create a large-scale work that was at least 6 meters high. So in order to do that, I had to create a studio-sized Tasriha in my own studio, which was 3 meters high, to be able to experience it, to be able to play with rope as hair, to manipulate it the same way we manipulate hair, to test trimming, to test braiding, different types of braid, different styles of braid, and so on. And so I wanted to really immerse myself in this material to be able to call it an analogy with hair, but then also to be able to understand how the scaling up a work plays in the narrative or the representation of what I'm trying to talk about. And I created that in my studio, but then taking it out to Minarat Saadiyat, that was the shift. I think that's where the work really started to happen and started to become what it is, because the space actually allowed me to learn that I am able to think in that scale. Because I knew that it was going to be high. I worked on it in that way in the studio, but then I wasn't able to expand the diameter of it. I did not know how much I can expand it, and when I expand it, what elements formally start to form and take shape and form. Like, for example, the way that all the rope was gathered in the middle, and it created some sort of like a tangle. But then all these outer ones that created straight lines, but then became like in perspective, very interesting to look at and turn around, and there's movement. There's so much that came to life that was not alive yet in my studio, and I did not know about it. So if I had not done this particular work, I wouldn't even know that that my mind can think like that. And so I think it's really important. So to answer your question, whether I'm continuing or not, I mean, I think I need a big space, yes, maybe. And I need help, because it takes a lot. It's a lot of labor. I was very lucky and fortunate that I had a few people helping me. I had a team working with me to prepare the material and such. And it's not an easy job, but I'm definitely interested in it.
I mean, it was so exciting seeing it for the first time, and then seeing the second iteration of في الشعر as well, and just to kind of see all of this progress going on. Yeah, we're excited to see what comes next, I guess. And also, Maisel, it was a first for you, producing your first solo show, A Turanian Love Note at Tashkil. And I think it would be interesting for the audience to hear what was it like to, you know, essentially produce your first exhibition. And if you could also speak about the mentorship from artists Lawrence Abu Hamdan and Ala Yunus.
Yeah, it was, I mean, it was quite the roller coaster. I think the whole process of putting up a show and going through the program. The program was really incredible and sort of like one of these kind of big highlights in your career that you sort of you're able to always come back to. And I think I say it's a roller coaster because it started in January 2020. But I had a couple of kind of professional engagements. I had like a conference talk, etc. And I knew that I wasn't going to really dig into it until March. So you can imagine that was kind of really unfortunate as far as a plan goes, because as soon as I wanted to actually start getting the studio, I had no studio access. And yet, you know, with all the anxiety that sort of like came with knowing that I still had to put up a show and I still had to produce a whole new body of work. And I also went into this program right after finishing grad school. And so I also had placed all this pressure on myself to really kind of think outside the grad school bubble, think outside the type of work that is an MFA kind of studio work. But I think with all that stress that sort of having this program happen in 2020 kind of induced, it still felt really like a real lifeline. It kept me moving in my practice. It also, the fact that I had, the investment of other people in it, like Lawrence and Ala, who are two incredible and incredibly generous minds, also really made me feel accountable for their time, and at the same time got me to explore kind of really new ideas in these conversations that I was having with them. So one of the things that was really kind of not planned is that most of the conversations with Lawrence and Ala, of course, were remote. But what that meant is I really kind of got to think very hard about what is it that I'm trying to do with my practice, and what is it that I'm trying to do with this specific kind of linchpin turn is kind of how I saw that point in my kind of creative career. And at least once a month I would meet with each of them, and we just talk about what things we're reading or looking at or thinking about. And so it was kind of an incredibly enriching experience in that sense. And I think the fact that a lot of the thinking happened on the screen really, really affected how I made the work, how I talk about the work, how I presented the work, but also actually really pushed how I think about plays. I had already, I think towards the end of grad school, actually, I had already been thinking about the potential for the digital to expand our understanding or our, reach, essentially, in terms of plays. This isn't a novel in any kind of shape or form, but in the specific kind of context of my practice, it was still new. But I think I definitely had started with the idea that it was a bit of a window or a portal or somewhere that gives you access somewhere else. And, I had developed a whole new body of work essentially on my screen, which, parts of that is a little, exhausting and miserable, but also the other part of it is, it really unveiled so much potential for the digital. I think, thinking of these, you know, cyberspaces as, you know, not infinite, but as also a place rather than a portal. It's got its own sort of set of social implicitly understood structures for how you kind of exist in it, how you deal with other people in it, which sometimes, and also how you police yourself and police others in it, or are policed by whatever, any sort of authorities online. And I think these things sometimes mirror our corporeal world, and other times just kind of really distort it. But I think, you know, what it really gave me is sort of this beginning of glimpse of thinking about the digital as, you know, a space of coming together, as sort of, again, this other place that we can kind of we have different rules to tweak to work within, etc. But also, you know, it felt like a really powerful tool of thinking about our corporeal realities, and not necessarily just mirror them or exist in there, but also maybe subvert them, or maybe even emphasize them, highlight them, etc. And I think that's, you know, the most exciting thing is that it was a really big project that I thought a lot about, and that at the end of it, I had more questions and I had more things that I wanted to continue to think about, etc. And I think, you know, I guess I couldn't think of a better scenario for my practice kind of moving in 2020 other than that.
Well, I think that brings us along nicely to, I mean, one of the main topics we wanted to discuss today is what it's like being an artist in the UAE. And you know what that day-to-day looks like. Afra, we wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your experience within the education system as a professor at Zayed University. What are your insights into arts education, and how do you see the ecosystem growing?
I think it's growing tremendously, no doubt. There's a big shift. There's a constant development, whether it's in the college, in the program itself that I am teaching in. Since I was a student and until now, but then most importantly, there's also a huge shift in the students themselves and what they are presenting. I think there's a big role that the internet and being aware, the research tools and methods that it developed throughout the years, and such short time, everyone has access to all the information they want and need. And I think that created a shift in the way that the art programs are developing. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yeah, I think, yeah, we might have lost you briefly, but... And
I think that most importantly, the students are developing very quickly with the program. And there's also a major shift in the numbers of students enrolling in the art college. And we've witnessed like a lot of there are big numbers coming in every semester. And so I think that those are definitely good indications that we're gonna have an even better ecosystem. But something that I wanted to also, there's a difference in the ecosystem as a whole, what also supports the academic institution. And it's not just having the art college, but also what is post the art college. And so I think around my time, there wasn't many programs that you can join post graduating from undergrad. So now you have, you know, the C Fellowship, you have the Sheikh Salam Emerging Artist Fellowship, you have the Cultural Foundations residency program. There are a lot of programs that help guide the artists. So when they graduate, their question is always, what do we do now? And we as Beit 15, for example, are also offering internships for students to come and work as an assistantship with one of the artists, or like we would facilitate other artists as well. But these are, I think, really promising, they're really promising moments for students when they graduate, and promising for the whole ecosystem. I think we're developing, and I think we're in a good place today to move forward and even develop further.
I totally agree with all your points, Afra. And, you know, I think every year we do see a lot of developments and kind of like the creative ecosystem flourishing even more and adding even more assets. And, you know, of course, even when Guggenheim Abu Dhabi as a museum also will become part of that ecosystem, as we're trying to build that up now as well. And I think also another really you know, important part, and I guess just a regular part of being an artist in the UAE, and probably mostly all over the world, is that we do have to balance our artist practice and studio practice, as well as a full-time job, in order to sustain ourselves and, you know, have that financial stability. So I know that both you, both Afra and Mace, both have to do this balancing act, including myself as well. And so I think, Mace, if we can start with you, if you can, yeah, just take us through your challenges or experiences or whatever you'd like to share about that.
Yeah, I think that the question of sort of the working artist is really, I mean, it's been kind of turning in my mind a lot, and I sort of would continue to welcome thoughts and conversations here and beyond. So I'm really happy to sort of have this brought up here. I think we really need to think, and I think we need to think publicly together about the sort of perception and the role also of the working artist. And maybe at least what I'm thinking about specifically is the artist that works in art institutions here in the UAE, or maybe potentially even broadly the region. I think there are very specific, maybe I'd say stigmas or stereotypes that we carry from kind of other parts of the world. And when we look at kind of artists with institutional employment, as, I mean, I think this is something that's kind of really internationally kind of understood. But I think specifically because of the way that our institutions run here, and the fact that they're relatively nascent and kind of tend to run on a slightly different structure than in other parts of the world, I think there is a conversation really to be had about what it means to have an artist employed in art institutions, and what it means, and what sort of opportunities or possibilities that can be explored because of this. I remember having sort of a conversation, a meeting at some point, and I work in programming at an art institution here in Abu Dhabi. And I remember someone saying, "Oh yeah, but institutions are made of people," and I think it's something that sometimes is really difficult to think of, even as someone that works in an institution. And I think it's difficult to break out of that, institutions being these sort of solid mass of thing, because we also reinforce it ourselves. Ever since I started my professional career in institutional work, I've also been a practicing artist. But it's only really actually recently, and after being a full-time artist and doing my MFA, that I've sort of started to break that barrier a little bit. But in the beginning of my career, that barrier felt really protective. It felt both imposed upon me and but also perpetuated by myself. And I think that is to the detriment of both my practice and my work institutionally. And I think there is something to be said about being part of an organization that is larger than yourself. And one of the few opportunities that we get to do that here is through institutional work. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think there are these, again, kind of like stigmas or stereotypes that we, that whether, you know, if you're an artist with an institutional position, one or the other is not is not really your work, quote unquote. But I wanted to push that a little bit because I think these two dovetail, and I think there's, yeah, I don't know. It's just something that I've been thinking about. I'd love to hear Afra's thought on this as well.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because I think that, you know, the question that we need to ask is, can we afford to be full-time artists, right? And this is a universal question. It's not just here, it's an international question. And I think that I don't think that we have the structure or the infrastructure for us to become full-time artists here in the UAE. Because one, you know, you have to make a living off of your work first, but you also, is it something that is normalized as a normal job, right? But then at the end of the day, you're making art and you'll have to sell your art. It's not a product. You don't want to make it commercialized. And so I think that it's very tricky when you think about it and how do you do that. But I think at the same time, I've personally found it, I used to work in corporate and I moved to academia, and I actually thought that being an academic is the best job for an artist, because then you're constantly learning as you're teaching, and you're teaching as much as you're learning. You have more hours than, like, you know, you're teaching a few hours, there's more preparation for your courses, but you still kind of buy a bit of your own time for your own practice. And so I think that it's really important to find that balance. I think every person works differently. And it's really important to find the balance between work as in your practice, your production you're making, versus your work where you actually earn a living. But then does it always have to be just about earning a living? Maybe it informs one another. In my case right now, it informs one another. And yes, I do want to be a full-time artist at some point, but so I'm working for it. I'm actually preparing everything that I need to be preparing for that moment. And so, yeah, I think that, yeah, and Mace, to answer your question, I think that it's different for each individual. And it is a universal question to, like, can you afford to be a full-time artist or not? But I also think it's important to find the balance that allows you to produce without feeling like you're missing your 60 or 30% and you're just giving it a little bit of your time. It has to be all your time. But I also feel like you need to be a full-time artist for a bit to understand what that means and what that feels like. And I think we both did our MFA, Mace, and had that sort of idea of time and what it is like to be fully consumed only for your practice.
I think, you know, the point about balance is something really interesting, because I also often, I remember having a conversation with a friend and about kind of sustaining yourself as an artist. And I think, you know, something that came up is, what is it that you want to compromise? Do you want to really start to think strategically about your work being your source of income? Do you want to compromise, like you said, on a little bit of your time, your energy, in a completely different sector, or your work in your creative energy, which is also, you know, finite, on a position that is within Yeah, exactly. And and I think for each, whether working in the creative sector institutionally or in a completely different field, or kind of sustaining yourself on your artwork, each of these actually impact your work in a different way. And so it is actually, it's exactly what you're saying. It's kind of thinking about what balance works for you, what allows you to actually achieve what it is that you want to achieve, which might not be necessarily the practice itself, but it could be your curiosity about something else. It could be the way that you kind of want to manage your time, or what part of your energies you want to reserve for yourself versus share with a different kind of structure, etc. I think that's a really good point.
Simrin, I wonder if you wanted to speak to that too, or otherwise in terms of how the various residencies you've done recently have informed your work.
In continuation of the conversation with Maisel and Afra, I'd like to give another perspective. Like, for example, after I finished my master's in India, I was a visiting professor at the College of Art. So I worked from 9 to 5. And I was quite tired by the end of the day to actually come back to the studio and really produce that level of work. So I think, it may work out for somebody, and it may not, like a full-time job may not work out for somebody. I was able to give workshops, but on a part-time basis. And I wanted to give back, and I wanted to have that interaction with others as well, like with children, with students. But yeah, it could not be, I could not sustain it at a level as a full-time job. So I think it depends. As Afra put it, like totally depends from individual to individual, how you balance your time and what you can do. Yeah. And in terms of residencies, I'd like to say that here in UAE, I think we have a lot of opportunities now in terms of residencies and the grants that are being offered to artists. From my personal experience with the Abu Dhabi Cultural Foundation, I think that the foundation, the grant that they gave us and the studio space that was given, it really encouraged the artists to look at how we could, utilize that space and that time. Plus, there was also a lot of engagement with curators who gave their insights and their valuable thoughts about your work. So, it helped to kind of evolve in a certain level in Cultural Foundation. Plus, you had the interaction with other residents who are very different in nature. You have people who are like designers, you have artists, somebody who's working with sculpture. So you have this, ongoing discussion and talk. Plus, the time that you get to work there, that was totally incredible. So not only from the production of the artwork, I'd say, to taking the artists to showcasing the artworks post the residency. Even the fact that we got the opportunity to do that with the Abu Dhabi Cultural Foundation, I think that was so incredible. I feel so obliged and I feel so humbled by this experience. And in terms of Manrat al-Sadiyat, I'm an artist in resident here. So this residency is slightly different in nature. Like in this residency, you give classes, like master classes for children and for adults, but it's not like a full-time job, but you are definitely engaged to, to teach your techniques and to learn more. Like, for example, we have the summer camp. We have 30 children coming in every morning, which is very exciting. And you get to learn a lot from them. In fact, I'm learning a lot about things like using a lot of color and how free they are. That's quite amazing. So I'm really enjoying that experience. So I think, and I want to say that DCT has done some amazing work as well, because they launched this initiative called Art Space, and I was lucky to be a part of that exhibition after the residency. So it was like taking the artwork right from the studio space and not putting it in a commercial gallery, but right in the middle of a mall. In the middle of the mall, you are not expecting, the audience was totally not expecting to see these gigantic artworks. They're used to buying, phones and other things. So when they saw the artwork there, they were so happy, and everybody was coming up and what is this? They were so inquisitive. And I was like so happy and taken aback by all the feedback and all the love. And I think that was, bringing, the artwork out of the studio into a public space. I think that's a very important thing that we need to look at to, the art scene for UAE. I think that's really going to accelerate a lot of people, like people who are not into arts, but they will be involved and they will be interested and coming forward, and not just as a hobby, but as a full-time career as being an artist. So it's been really good. I'm really enjoying it. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Simrin. I'm sure all our colleagues at DCT are super happy to hear your compliments. Thank you. And yes, art space is definitely a way that, thinking about how to adapt to our certain culture and environment. I mean, the mall is very much like a main space in our culture, and why not just put art galleries and art spaces in there where everyone is? Bring the art to the people, I guess. We're right on time with our 15 minutes. We're going to open up the floor for questions. And I'd like to direct this question. I guess we can start with Afra. For those watching who may be looking to become artists themselves, what advice would you share?
Have a studio space. Always have a studio space. Yeah, and keep making. I think it's the continuity that matters, the commitment and the continuity of making that sustainable, ongoing process is very important. I get a lot of my students asking me, what do we do when we graduate? Like, what do we work on? How do we work on an idea? Where do we start? And it's very easy to fall into the trap of only making work for exhibitions and only making work for commissions, or it's like it's very easy way to fall into, because you're as a student, you're used to responding to assignments, but when those assignments are over, then what are you responding to? Because that's when you start finding your own voice. And it's really important to continue making. And a lot of times, even in my own practice, I go to the studio, and especially if I'm away from the studio for a week or two or even more and then come back, it's really hard to jumpstart a momentum. And it's the hardest. And you come and you're like, what does anything even mean? And what do I do now? Like, I even forgot how I made this. But you do anything. I start cleaning my studio. If I have like surfaces that needs to be coated, I just coat and do nothing. Just do, mindless things that don't need you to think of why. You're just making something. And a lot of times these things end up in trash because they're literally nothing. It's just me scribbling on a surface, or me coating a surface, or literally just collecting objects similar to one another, or materials, putting them in the same place, categorizing and such. But it's something. It's going to the studio, it's building up that energy in that space, it's building that momentum, it's getting your headspace running in that same pace, in that same environment. And so you're building that energy within your space. So don't ever think that if you go to the studio, don't know what to do, then you're out of there. Don't leave. Even if you don't do anything, just spend the day, have your meals, and spend your time on your phone or whatever. Just stay in that space. It's important, and commit to it.
I think, can I
Please.
add a layer to that? Thank you. I think this also applies if you are unable to have a studio space as you imagine the perfect studio space would be, separate, something completely and solely dedicated to your practice. I think things that you learn about studio culture can still apply wherever or however you make your work. And I think the thing about just setting a time for you to just be in the space or the setup that within which you create is so important. And I think this is across all creative disciplines. You know, you don't, even if, just like Afra said, it's just cleaning up. Even if, you know, if your creative space is a Word doc because you're writing, you know, free writing is essentially what Afra was describing for a studio space. It's just getting your body, your mind comfortable with this is the time to make, and it doesn't matter what we're making at this moment. It matters that I've set the time aside, and it becomes muscle memory in a sense. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that rigor, or that discipline actually, rather than rigor. I'm not a fan of the word rigor, but that discipline would still benefit you even if you aren't able to have your own dedicated studio space, and not having your own dedicated studio space should not deter you from practicing that discipline.
I'd like to jump into this conversation a little bit. Yeah. So I'd like to say, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
I'd like to, give a message to young artists to be patient. You know, in the beginning, there'll be a lot of opportunities of, just kickstarting your career with a lot of shows. And that could also be very tempting. But I think a person has to sit back and analyze their work first. They need to think about how they can develop their work. Maybe they can be a part of some programs which will enhance their work. And after that, when they're more comfortable and they think that this is the right time to, move ahead, I think that's the time they can, actually think of working on exhibitions and putting an entire body of work together. So it's also about, looking at how you can grow as an artist every day. Like, even that little 1%, it matters. Like you research on something, or you read something, you kind of sketch something maybe, and then eventually one small step leads to a larger step. So I think that's the message I'd like to give them. And you have to trust yourself. I mean, you know best about your work after a certain point and how much time and dedication you can give to it. So I mean, you really need to have faith in yourself. Yeah, that's it.
I think that's great advice, to sort of trust in the process and that it will all come through eventually. I'd like to take another question from our audience, and this is a question for Afra and Simrin. Simrin, you've sort of touched on it a little already, but they're asking, how do your students influence the way you approach your own art practice? Maybe Afra, you want to speak to that?
Sure. I think that it's really interesting when my students come and ask me about a particular process and I don't know it. And I just tell them, okay, I actually don't know, but I'll find out. And that becomes learning a new process. That becomes searching and trying to find out, experimenting and understanding how a particular process works. So for example, someone comes and tells me, oh, can we cast resin and mix, for example, cement into it, or let's mix glass into the mixture and make a mold that's, all these different things that don't like each other. And I'll have to try to understand whether that works. And I think that then becomes a lot of times, many of these processes become part of my work. I go back to my studio and I'm like, actually, like I tried this and this works. Let me, use that in my work or and I think a lot of it is remembering. Over the past, I would say 6 years, I've been learning a lot of techniques, a lot of skill sets. And sometimes I forget what I even know. And when I'm asked by my students, sometimes I remember and I'm like, oh, actually, I did learn how to do this and I do know how to. And so it keeps coming back. And that's why I said that the relationship between faculty and students is very generative relationship, and it's very fruitful. It's constantly a process of learning, and it's a two-way road. I'm learning from them and they're learning from me and vice versa. And I think that that's really important.
Okay. I think with me, like, you know, giving classes to students, you get to see another perspective of the same thing. Like, for example, I gave a master class on, you know, working with natural forms and exploring nature. But everyone had such a different perspective on the same topic. You know, how children approached it, how adults approached it, what was their view of the subject. I got them to my studio space and they were like, everybody had a different interpretation of the artwork. So, I mean, you get that constant dialogue with different people. So I think that is very, very exciting. Yeah, and even in terms of technique, like you try to explain a particular technique and they want to do it a different way. So, I mean, yeah, it's like Afra said, it's like a learning thing. Like you teach them and you learn back from them. And that's very engaging, I think. That's a lot of fun as well.
I think we have time for one more question, and this is directed to you, Mace. Mace, does body language like gestures, expression, and movement also influence your work?
I have been looking at gestures for a very long time, actually, but I think maybe not in the sense that we understand gestures as body language, but rather we understand gestures as signs, as in like in you know, they carry a meaning that you know, like a bye or a wave, etc. I haven't yet dug into sort of a more kind of deep exploration of body language, because I think the thing that I've been interested in, and even actually the thing that led me to think about gestures as sort of a form of communication, it is kind of, again, the form of the body. So this relationship between body and place, and there's a Czech philosopher that has a book titled Gestures, so sort of very apt for this question, that talks about the gesture of speaking. He also talks about the gesture of writing, this gesture of taking a video, watching a film, photographing. I actually really recommend the book, and it's one of my favorites. So it's very, this isn't helpful. It's called Gesture by Willem Flusser. And it's a book that sort of was really influential in how I think about the body and speech in general, and language, and locating language within the body. So it's sort of an oblique way of answering the question, but I think that's the reference that I point everyone to there. You know, Willem Flusser writes in sort of short chapters. They're really interesting to read. They flow very smoothly. So I totally recommend it.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. We've come to the end of our panel discussion. It's been such a wonderful journey getting to know all of you on a much deeper level, and also within your art practices, going to interview you and visit your studios. It's really fantastic. So I do like to thank you for all sharing your thoughts and practices with us. Thank you, Afra, Mace, and Simrin. A warm thanks also to everyone joining us today for the culmination of the second iteration of In the Studio. Look out for the next one next summer as well. If you haven't had a chance to see the In the Studio videos just yet, they're all available now to view on abudhabiculture.ae. You can also follow Abu Dhabi Culture on Instagram, where they're on IGTV as well. And we invite you to learn more about the artists here with us today by visiting their studios, through their video series, and sharing this experience with your friends and family. Thank you again, and hope you join us for the next Guggenheim Abu Dhabi program.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Okay.